Okay, that's fine. Thanks very much, Shireen, for starting the recording. Welcome to those in attendance at this remote meeting of our pre-application forum. Please note that the meeting will be recorded and published online for public access after. If you could switch off your microphones and or mute your microphones and switch off your cameras just to allow the system to run a bit more smoothly. Obviously, if you're invited to speak, you can switch on your microphone at that stage. Before us today, I'll just run through the agenda proper. So welcome to Ben Coulston and to Jonathan Smith. I'll let them introduce themselves when it comes to their slot on the agenda. But if we could just go to the agenda for now. So we've got the introduction and procedure notes for guidance for members. I'm assuming everyone's got that, unless I hear otherwise. Nope, okay. The minutes of the previous pre-application forum on the 24th of September 2020 are there for approval. Hopefully our memories will serve us well. They're on pages 7 to 12. And again, unless I hear otherwise, I'll just take that as approved. Okay, thanks, folks. So we'll move swiftly on to the main item on the agenda today, which is the proposal of application notice for a major development of an erection of a battery-based energy storage facility at Dice at Fairburn Place, Aberdeen, application 201599. And we have Mr. Gavin Clark, who's the planning officer dealing with this. And I'll just hand over to him and then we'll move on to the applicants. Gavin.
Thanks, Convener. I'll just share my presentation and then I'll get started.
Perfect.
So the proposal we have in front of us at the pre-application forum today relates to a major development for the erection of a battery storage energy facility on land to the north of Fairburn Terrace and to the west of the main Aberdeen to Inverness railway line in Dice. The proposal is considered to be a major development as electricity generation which exceeds 20 megawatts falls within this category. This is an overview of the site here. So if you just see where my cursor is, that is the application site boundary there. We'll have Fairburn Terrace to the south, the railway line which runs along here. And then it's not on screen, but if you go to the west, Aberdeen International Airport's just off the screen to the west. In terms of principle, the site is zoned as a mixed-use area in the Aberdeen Local Development Plan, which advises that proposals for development or change of use within such areas must take account of the existing uses and character of the surrounding area and avoid undue conflict with adjacent land uses and amenity. Where new industrial, business or commercial uses are permitted, development should not affect the amenity of people living and working in the area. So you see this yellow colour, that's the H2 designation. We have the purple, which is H1 residential areas, and to the south, and a different shade of purple, is B1 business and industrial, and just off screen on the western side here, that would just be the airport designation. So just a couple of photographs of the site looking north. These flats were constructed sort of about 10 years ago, and this is a site just sort of covered here when looked at from Google Maps. And then another image sort of looking from the north of the site, south. Matters that need to be considered include the layout, scale and design of development, any required landscaping, transport and accessibility, noise, natural heritage, drainage, waste and refuse storage, sustainable development, potential for land contamination and potential impacts on the airport, which sits to the west. Documents required in support of a future application are detailed on page 5 of the report. I'm happy to answer any questions, but as I say, it was just a short presentation from me introducing the proposal.
Thank you very much, Gavin. I'll let you can you just drop that?
I'll just drop that, yeah, no problem. There you go.
Perfect, thanks very much. Members, we'll now hear from the applicants, and I think it's Jonathan who will perhaps lead us through their application.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting us to today's presentation. What I'll do, I'll just share my screen with the presentation we have for you to make sure that's working, you can see it. And then I'll just drop off so that I can run through that. So just,
yeah, it's there, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. So I'll just pull that up to start from the beginning. Okay, is that showing the full screen for everyone now?
No, we've got a corner, or maybe that, no, that is the full screen. Sorry, it's just the design of, apologies.
All right, okay, is that showing?
Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Oh, okay, brilliant. Okay, I'll run through that then. Yes, again, thank you for inviting us to give this presentation today. My name is Jonathan Smith, so I'm the planning consultant for the project, and on the call with me is Ben Colston, and he's representing the client. To give you a bit of an agenda, we just want to give you a bit of a background to the company, to Crackside Energy, and also a bit of context and background to the technology involved and the reasons for it as well. And then we will run through the site-specific project details and the key, what we see as the key considerations for the site, and then of course open to questions from yourselves. Okay, so who are we? I'll pass you over to Ben, who can give you a bit of background context to Crackside Energy.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I've put my camera off just because of the bandwidth issues, but yeah, hopefully I'm audible to everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure, as Jonathan said, to have the opportunity to speak with you at this forum this afternoon. And as Jonathan mentioned, I'm Ben Colston, and I represent Crackside Energy Limited on this project as a lead developer. Crackside itself develops grid-scale energy schemes. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of Omni Partners, which itself was founded in 2004. And as a team, I guess what defines us, we're passionate about the ongoing energy transition and the drive towards emissions reduction. That's what crafts the sentiment behind a lot of the projects that we look at, and this is reflected in our current focus entirely, which is on the development of renewable and flexible energy projects, and we concentrate on projects in the UK at the current time. We have a small pipeline of similar projects located at strategic locations across the UK, and yeah, this represents our current focus, and a lot of those are very similar to the ones we'll be discussing with you today.
Okay, thanks, Ben. So we'll sorry if my slide works. There you go. So Ben will also provide a bit of context to explain exactly what energy storage is, in case you're not familiar with the concept.
Yeah, sure. Listen, you know, a lot of people may have some awareness of energy storage already, but if I'll start from sort of the top, and maybe it'll gather some interest in some questions towards the end. As in many sectors, and it's no different in the sort of energy and electricity sector, and with the increasing drive for decarbonisation, the current period is seen as an important transitional time in the sector. And I guess to bring this to life, almost 45% of UK electricity in 2020 was produced from renewable sources, and that was an outperformance against fossil fuels for the first time ever. Scotland itself regularly exceeds renewable output sufficient to power over 90% of the country's total electricity consumption, and this contributes to around 25% of GB's renewable energy generation. So whichever way you sort of carve up the statistics, I think it's fair to say the rate and volume of renewable deployment itself and the planned projects is impressive. But it is also important that a balanced mix of technology is deployed to sort of facilitate this, and this specifically helps to ensure that renewable resources can be utilised to their full potential. You know, the predictability of renewable energy is different to you know the base load generation that we've been used to over the years. It's important that the integration of renewables can be achieved cost effectively, you know, curtailing renewables and also improving local infrastructure and national grid infrastructure is a challenge when you've got a large amount of non-synchronous intermittent generation coming onto the system. The grid network on both a national and a local scale can remain resilient and able to cope with the new supply mix that we're seeing onto the system. And finally, I guess it's a rappel that the transition towards a low carbon future is as cost effective and as possible for the consumer. So with the specific reference to the role that energy storage technology plays, you know, it's fair to say it's a key enabler for this transition, and really essentially does what it says on the tin. It stores excess electricity when the grid has been oversupplied, and it exports it back to the network when the grid is undersupplied. So it's critical in helping to balance variation between supply and demand. It also ensures that the grid remains resilient, as I mentioned, to fluctuations on the network, which are largely brought about by intermittent generation from renewables. And in doing so, the technology provides critical system services to essentially maintain the quality of the network and ensure that the supply remains uninterrupted. So energy storage does not only provide it doesn't provide baseload power or generation potential. It acts as a backup reserve, operating only at times when there is a functional or market signal for it to do so. In terms of location, we see Scotland as an important area for the location of grid-scale storage in order to help support grid resilience and effective balancing of renewable energy deployment. And this really is how the project at DICE has come about. Over to you, Jonathan.
Okay, thanks, Ben. So if we look at the site specifics then, this just picks up on the slides that Gavin has already provided to you to show you where the site is located. But the image on the right, of course, is the wider scale location map. And then on the left-hand side, we have the site itself outlined with the red circle. We have the airport to the west, the existing residential flats of Fairburn Terrace to the north, the main line to the east and residential beyond, and then a mix of industrial units and hotel around the south and southwest of the site. So in terms of the layout itself, effectively what it is a series of what we call battery energy storage systems. So they are depicted by the grey rectangular images, and effectively they're a series of batteries within these container type arrangements. And they're all linked to a series of transformers and inverters, which are denoted by the orange and the blue shapes on the screen as well. And they're all then linked in turn to a network provider kiosk, which is to the north of the site here, denoted by the rectangular building. And the idea is they're all linked together into the kiosk, which is the operating control room, and then in turn it is linked via a compound through to the grid, and that will be to an existing substation further to the north of the site in DICE. In terms of general layout, the site, the units themselves are based on kind of concrete plinths, and then surrounding those will be mainly hardcore or gravel as general surfacing to the site. Through the site you will see there's a road running through there for vehicular access, and that will be laid out to typically tarmac. Around the periphery of the site will be site boundaries in terms of site fencing, and also some walling and acoustic fencing. And then around the periphery of the site in general, we would be implementing a scheme of landscaping as well. So that just gives an idea of the general kind of layout of the proposal. The illustrations here give you an idea of what they look like from a kind of a 3D perspective. So the image on the left is looking north. So that's looking towards the flats of Fairburn Place in the background there. And then the image on the right-hand side is looking in the opposite direction. So to the top of the picture, which is the south and southwest, you can see the existing industrial units and the edge of the airport there. So you can see the containers themselves are kind of typically light type container size in terms of scale, so they're not huge in terms of the scale of the structures themselves. So looking at what we consider the key issues associated with the proposals and the development, firstly we'll look at the construction and operation. So to give an idea, these the battery units themselves are all prefabricated, so they're all kind of arranged off site. And they're all modular, so they arrive at site typically by a low loader and then are craned into position and essentially fitted together. What that allows is a kind of a fairly minimal construction time on site, because everything is done beforehand. It's then just put together on site, and then all the various connections are made. In terms of managing the site, there's very little activity on a day-to-day basis. So the site is operated remotely via CCTV and a central control room. And the only visits to the site will be required through routine maintenance, which will be periodic, probably just 1 or 2 workers at a time, if that. And they would typically come to site via a small van or even private car, so there won't be a lot of comings and goings to the site at all. And maintenance in general is fairly low level. In terms of the operation of the site, as Ben mentioned, this is all about demand. So it only kicks in as and when there is a demand on the grid. Typically, that tends to be the morning and evening peak periods when people are kind of getting ready and getting up to go to work, and then in the evening when they come home and then have their tea. So that's when it's most likely to be kicking in. But it is available 24/7 depending on when that demand is required. But the point to make, I suppose, is in terms of actually running, it's only ever for short periods at a time. So typically that might be somewhere in the region of 30 minutes duration, just to put that energy back into the system as needed. Well, some of the other issues that we consider pertinent are to do with the noise and transport. Overall, there's fairly minimal noise producing plant associated with it, so there's nothing in the terms of rotary equipment or anything like that. The noise would be from the battery units and the inverters and the transformers, but there's nothing in the way of kind of machinery as such. It's all kind of electrical components, and consideration is given to that in terms of the layout to make sure that they are located as far away as possible from any sensitive receptors. As part of the application, we'll be submitting an appropriate noise assessment, and the purpose of that is to make sure that the existing noise levels are not impaired, so that anything that's submitted from the proposal is going to be no greater than what's there at the moment, and particularly in terms of sensitive receptors, as I say, the residential to the north. And I think the point to make again is that this isn't a continuous operation at all, so this isn't like having a constant diesel generator running in the background or anything along those lines. It is just a case of kicking in a short periods of time as and when the grid requires it. As I mentioned, the construction period is kept to a minimum, so the civil works are done on site, making sure it's all level, making sure the appropriate drainage infrastructure goes in. But then, as I mentioned, the equipment actually comes in in modular forms. So that's all fairly quickly put together on site with a minimal disturbance and minimal traffic generation. And as I say, it's all operated remotely as well, with low level traffic generation being just required for maintenance on a periodic basis. And that typically will be, as I say, through a light good vehicle or even private car. Some of the other issues we'll look at is ground conditions and hydrology. So we have undertaken assessments of the area to see what potential contaminations there are on site. And that also then looks at any appropriate mitigation required to make sure the site is clean and fit for purpose. And of course, that will be done before any development takes place. And in a similar vein, we look at potential flood risk for the site. As some of you are probably aware, there is the Farburn running to the south of the site, and there has been historically some issues of flood risk in the area as well. So one of the key issues is to make sure that whatever we put on site doesn't have this knock-on effect in terms of flood risk further downstream. And tied in with that then also is an appropriate drainage design for the scheme as well, to make sure that the whole thing works properly without any knock-on impact. There isn't actually any requirement for foul sewer on site. It's just surface water that we will need to look at. And then another of the key issues is habitat and landscape. So as you can see from the pictures there, the site is fairly bare. There's not a great deal on there. We've done an ecological assessment. There's no issues of habitat or ecological constraints on site, so that gives us pretty much a clean site to work with. But what we will do, of course, is make sure that the construction operation takes into account the wider habitat in the wider area as well, to make sure that that is done appropriately with no knock-on effects. And also, as part of the scheme, we'll be looking to introduce new landscaping around the periphery of the site. That not only helps assimilate the site in terms of the street scene and the visual appearance, but also helps create a new habitat as well in the way of shrub and tree planting. So that concludes the presentation. We didn't want to kind of overly prolong it, so hopefully that covers the key issues and points to make. Hopefully I've just ended my slideshow, and I shall just pull up my camera again so that we can answer any questions you may have. But thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jonathan. That was really interesting, and obviously as a city we're really pushing forward in advancing sort of net zero innovation. I will open the floor probably to questions for other members. I have got a few myself, but I thought I'll maybe allow the other members if anybody's got any questions. All right, so I can just find to see if I've got any. Apologies, it's just taking a minute to load them up. Yeah, sorry, Councillor Gregg and then Councillor Henriksson.
Thank you, convener. I've got two questions. The first one is a technical one about the policy H2 on mixed use. Will an energy storage facility comply with that, or would it require a change of use?
I'll maybe ask Mr. Clark to respond to that question. Gavin.
Yeah, in terms of policy, we would just need to ensure that in terms of H2, we just need to ensure that the proposal didn't have an adverse impact on the character or amenity of the surrounding area, and it would be up to the applicants to submit the information to do that, to ensure compliance with policy. So once that information is submitted with the planning application, we will then be able to make an assessment of whether it complies with policy.
Right, great, thank you. Maybe related to that, the diagrams showed, the site layout showed that there was a border of trees, and as Farburn Terrace flats are directly on the north edge, I imagine that the landscape strategy and ecology assessment will be quite important. So was that a border of trees to try and address issues of residential amenity? And I mean, basically, are there other efforts to ensure that it's a green type of development as far as you can be, at least to soften the impact environmentally?
Yeah, so we're mindful that there's at least two elevations to the site which are quite prominent. That northern elevation, as you say, towards the flats, and the eastern elevation alongside the road there as well. So we're looking at that twofold really. One is to put a good standard boundary treatment to there as well, to give some presence to the street scene. But the other thing was to help soften the appearance of that with the planting as well. So the trees shown on the plans and on the 3D images are indicative, but that we're getting a landscaping scheme drawn up at the moment, and that will typically be a mixture of tree planting as well as shrub planting as well at low level. We would normally take advice from the planners on that in terms of the most appropriate form of planting to include. We will kind of put together a scheme, and then that will be subject to discussion to see what's most appropriate. But yeah, as you say there, one of the issues of that was to make sure that aesthetically the site doesn't look out of place, particularly in terms of the residential receptor to the north. So that was one of the reasons for doing that. And that planting is likely then to continue around some of the other boundaries as well, where it might also be sensitive, albeit the western and southwestern boundaries are more kind of aligned to the industrial uses, probably not such a sensitive environment in that respect.
That's true. I mean, it is less sensitive over there, but still, you'll be contributing towards the green agenda with that. Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gregg. Councillor Henriksson.
Thank you, convener. Yeah, I've just got a question about the units themselves regarding the possibility of overheating, whether that is actually a risk, whether that could actually deteriorate into the risk of possible fire and what the consequences of that would be for these units. Yeah, that's my first question. Thank you.
I don't know if you want to take it, Jonathan, or Ben, whichever.
Yeah, I'll hand you over to Ben, so you can give a bit of a background to that.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I can take that. So the chemistry of the batteries that are proposed are lithium ion, and the latest lithium ion chemistry is not prone to thermal runaway like some of the earlier generations of the chemistry were, which you may well have have read about. I guess that then over and above that, as safeguarding measures as we expect from any type of development such as this, you have fire detection and thermal runaway or thermal sensors on the individual units that are packaged individually, and a control system in place so you can shut things down individually if there are anomalies in terms of heat generation from any particular cell. So I think there's two factors. There's one that the chemistry's moved on, and the thermal runaway just at source isn't prone to the type of thermal runaway that we saw in the early generations. And secondly, the control systems monitoring detection and suppression has moved on as well with the evolution of the technology. So it's important that these things are taken into account during final design, but there's certainly precedent for making sure that these things are controlled correctly as well.
Mr. Henderson.
Yeah, thank you for that reassurance. Just with regards to the noise, you did say that there was no moving parts as such. So how much noise do they actually generate? Is it I'm thinking of along the lines of a substation, a transformer substation, and the kind of noise that they generate. Is it a sort of similar noise to that? And will I take it that the sound deadening wall and vegetation around the border would mitigate most of that?
Jonathan, I can take the first part, and maybe you can talk about the second part there. Sure. So in terms of the thought, I think you've broadly hit the nail on the head in terms of the types of noise that you'd expect. It's electrical equipment rather than rotating machinery. So the sort of buzz you get from your residential transformers, I guess, that you see on new resi developments, that kind of, if you listen closely enough, that's some of the background noise that you could experience. I guess the components which contribute to noise, generally the cooling, and these are what they call ACC, but essentially air conditioning units, which ensure that the temperature around the cells for the units stay at a temperature that's within the tolerable ranges of the equipment operating. And that really does depend on the external temperature. So, you potentially expect these to operate more in the summer, during the day, during the heat of the day. And, in the evening, if it did operate, then you wouldn't expect them to be on as much, or certainly not at full load. So they're the main sources. I mean, by no means I wouldn't describe the infrastructure itself as noisy. They're not intended, or they're not, they don't output much noise from that perspective. But clearly, we need to make sure that in any given location that they are installed, we think about things that might need to be attenuated or mitigated. And perhaps Jonathan, you can pick up on the specifics there.
Yeah, sure. So as part of that, we have undertaken a noise impact assessment, or rather are currently undertaking a noise impact assessment. And the aim of that is to make sure that there is no impact, of course, from the operation itself. What they do is look at the nearest noise sensitive receptors, and in this case, of course, it's the flats to the north. So their monitoring position is taken from there. And they also take it from an open window scenario, I believe. So they're looking at potentially the worst case scenario. And what the aim of that is to make sure that any noise emitting from this use is no greater than is currently there. In terms of the assessment, there is kind of, I suppose it could be argued that is the environment already noisy because you have the airport next door and things like that. The noise assessment doesn't take it that way. They see it as being, well, we see what the kind of the general situation is. So that could be quite a low level. So the idea being to make sure that we're no no noisier than what that current level is. Combined with that is to make sure that the machinery, or sorry, the equipment is located in the appropriate position. So that's where you might recall from the layout that the inverters and the transformers are kind of located further away from the sensitive boundaries. And combined with that then is potentially a series of acoustic barriers. So these are typically your kind of timber barriers, which will be surrounding the various elements of equipment within the site. And combined with that, as you mentioned, there will also be the external or the peripheral boundary treatments as well, which will be a mix of either wall or acoustic barrier combined with the planting as well. So all these things combined help to ensure that there is no noise impact overall from the proposals.
Thank you, convener. That's very informative. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Henriksen. Councillor Copeland.
Yes, thank you, convener. It's partly answered what I was going to ask, but if these are silly boy questions, I apologise in advance because I'm not upon this. But I take it the noise assessment, there's more noise when you said it kicks in the high demand times like the morning and evening. So there'll be more noise in those periods than there would be when the equipment's basically asleep. Would that be right?
Yeah, in standby mode, there's very little contribution at all in terms of noise, and that's a minor humming from the sort of electrical equipment, the transformers. If it's not running, there's no need to cool generally the plant. So yeah, as you say, during standby periods there'll be little to no contribution. It will need to be up and running for the main noise sources, and even then, unless it's it depends on how it's operating. If it's operating for very short periods of time, then it may not need to have the full complement of, say, the coolers and the inverters. So the contribution, the approach we needed to make clearly from a noise perspective is that the worst case scenario is that it will be running at full load at the periods of time when it's running, and the reality to that behind that is that that's unlikely to be the case. But we need to make that judgment that it's going to be the worst possible contribution during, say, the nighttime hours, and make sure that we design the appropriate inbuilt design attenuation and acoustic mitigation as appropriate. But through detailed design, there'll be more analysis on what the realistic situation is in terms of operational profile and operational conditions.
Okay, thanks for that. Second question, if you'll bear with me, convener, is how close to the flats do you anticipate this would be?
If I come in on that one, and if you just bear with me, I'll just double check on our screen. So the site is roughly, I think it's about 25 meters or so away from the flats to the north, and then there's a distance of somewhere in the region of 4 to 5 meters within the site to the kiosk buildings, and then the actual units themselves, the battery units, are then located further away. If you just bear with me, I shall just see if I can quickly scale that off. Yeah, it looks like the nearest kind of battery container to the residential is somewhere in the region of about 25 to 30 meters from that the nearest property there.
Okay, and can I ask, have you got a similar facility anywhere else?
So I can tell you, we, as Craigside, we haven't got any operational facilities. We've got a number going through planning that we're working with solution providers on. My background is with a larger energy company where we've had facilities of this nature operating. But as it stands at the moment, Craigside don't have any operational facilities now.
Okay. If you'll bear with me, convener,
Yes.
are you aware of any other similar facilities anywhere else, not necessarily owned by yourselves?
UK wide, I mean, there's about 1 gigawatts worth of energy storage assets of this technology type installed across the UK, providing frequency response and balancing services to the grid operator. So that translates to quite a few projects if they're project sizes range from say 5 to traditionally sort of 50 megawatts, and you've got about 1,000 megawatts worth, over 1,000 megawatts worth of projects installed across the UK now.
Okay, thank you. And how much storage capacity do you intend to have at this site?
So that's to be determined through final design, because the technology is evolving quite quickly. But typically what we'd expect is between an hour and 2 hours of storage capacity. Typically the units that are installed now are around about an hour. And as the technology evolves and the footprint condenses, longer duration opportunities exist as well. It depends on what the grid operator is requiring at the time that it's actually delivered. Yeah. But we certainly anticipate between 1 and 2 hours. That's the expectation.
Yeah, I was thinking more megawatts than time.
Okay, so well, if it's a 30 megawatt power scheme. So if you've got a 2 hour system, that's 60 megawatt hours. If you've got a 1 hour system, that's 30 megawatt hours.
Okay, this might be one for Gavin, if you'll bear with me, convener.
Mm-hmm.
Would this require a health assessment?
I don't think so. I can double check that and get back to you, but I don't think so.
I'll tell you where my thinking is on this. I know that they've done studies about people living beside electricity pylons and stuff. Mm-hmm. Now, that might be totally left field, I don't know. I just wondered if a similar type installation elsewhere in the country required a health assessment or its health effects, if any, that could be maybe looked at.
Yeah, I can certainly have a look into that, and if it is required, then we'll obviously have it with a planning application.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your forbearance, convener. Thank you.
That's all right. Thanks, Councillor Copeland. Councillor McGregor, welcome. I see your hand.
Thanks very much, convener. Yeah, I had some similar questions to Councillor Copeland. In terms of electromagnetic emissions, are there any identified electromagnetic emissions, and or was there any need to consult the airport? Thank you.
Ben, do you want to come in on the first issue, and then I'll just mention about the airport as well?
Yeah, apologies, I was on mute there. In terms of the electromagnetic emissions, so there's no sort of there's a precedent for these developments being installed in proximity to residential developments, to commercial development, and to other land use, without the requirement for any kind of barrier provisions. The electromagnetic emissions aren't such that it requires that type of mitigation. I guess there'll be a HSE type guidance on the potential contribution, but it's not something that is built into the design to protect against any emissions of that nature.
Okay.
In terms of the airport safeguarding, there is an airport safeguarding area policy which we do need to address as part of the planning application. That is probably more aligned to building scale and the potential for building heights and so on, so as opposed to any type of emissions. But Gavin can probably give a bit more detail, but certainly in terms of general aviation or the aviation requirements and electricity provision, there is no kind of connection there. So there's no kind of impact that needs to be addressed to anything along those lines at all. It's mainly about building scale.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add in there that we will, if and when a planning application is submitted, we would consult Aberdeen Airport due to the proximity of the site.
That's right. Good. I was going to say, and don't have any fruit trees in amongst your boundary vegetation, because they don't like to attract birds to the airport. Right. On the understanding that this is your first one, and there's not going to be any actual employment at the site, but that you're going to have a remote CCTV operator somewhere looking to see that nobody's stealing your valuable lithium batteries. Are you concerned about security at all? And is there a need to have the security cameras and a remote viewer of these cameras rather than somebody in site making sure all is well? Thanks.
So our intention would be to install CCTV, as you mentioned, so we can monitor both, the security of the site, but also, have a remote monitoring from a control room. In terms of it being our first, I guess, I think if I understand the sentiment of your question, there's two parts to that. That we'd have an operational partner that provide this functionality in terms of operating this type of equipment and monitoring this type of equipment centrally for a number of customers, a number of clients, a number of asset owners. And they would monitor from a central control room a number of assets, and would do the same for this facility. At this stage, we don't know who that partner might be, and then that would, subject to getting planning and obviously being able to move forward with the project, we would, make those necessary connections and contracts. As a business going forward, our intention is that we would, sort of incorporate the capability internally to do that, and not have to rely on contract partners necessarily. But I guess that's a slight side issue. As a general theme, there are operators, optimizers, route to market providers that specialize in these types of assets that can provide the contracts and services we require.
Right. I was also interested in, and it's not a question you ask in planning, why there, but I would imagine that from an electrical point of view, either these sorts of battery and grid stabilization facilities would be most appropriate either right next to the generation side of it, where presumably the land is cheaper, or right next to where it's used. So does that imply that you're hopeful that our nearby industrial estates will be consuming a lot more electricity than they are now? Thanks. That's not really a planning question, is it?
Not really.
No, I can certainly give a view on that. I guess there's two angles to come at. Yes, quite often energy storage is co-located, and that can be co-located with renewable generation. Quite often you're seeing schemes built alongside solar and even offshore and onshore wind, associated with their infrastructure. So they can have a real-time, capability, I guess, from the wider asset to balance supply, demand, and impact to infrastructure. But it's connected to the local network, which is connected to the national network. So to the extent that that there's a supply and demand issue, this asset, whilst it's connected to the distribution network operator and can provide services on a local level, it's connected to the wider infrastructure. So if there's a frequency response issue on the national network, it's capable of supporting that as well. So proximity to other generation, in some respects can help, but it's not critical in terms of its functionality. The second part is that it's in reasonable proximity to its point of connection, and by that I mean the entry point into the local distribution network, which is about 1 kilometre north of the site, Zeiss substation, just over 1 kilometre north, and that's pretty critical. Having a location that you can obviously connect to and can provide the functionality, the full functionality of the asset, which is obviously consuming and exporting energy onto that network node.
That's great. Thanks very much. I mean, that was really good. I touched on the question of the value of this lithium stuff, and presumably this is actually a huge investment. And from the security point of view, you'll want to make sure your security fence is really of top quality, and also from a point of view of the residents and the flats nearby, you want the vegetation surrounding it to do so.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry, good.
No, you go, and I'll follow you.
Yeah, I guess to your point, yeah, of course, yeah, we want to ensure the asset's safe, you know, from any unexpected, you know, people trying to access, but we don't want that to happen for their safety. Equally, you know, we want to protect and safeguard the asset itself. So, you know, that's a key point for us. Jonathan, potentially you can pick up on the landscaping element.
Yeah, so typically, as you mentioned, there's a security issue for the site itself, and also, of course, for the wider safety of the public, and of course that needs to be balanced also against the visual amenity and public amenity in the area as well. So this is where we are trying to provide a combination of more substantial type boundary treatment to the prominent elevations in the street scene, and then you more traditional security fencing around the less sensitive boundaries around the site. And then, as you point out, there it's a case of making sure that any planting is complementary to that as well, to ensure that it doesn't act as a potential screen to diminish any security, whilst balancing that against making sure it achieves a pleasant visual street scene perspective as well.
Right. Okay. I think my last question is not really a question at all. The site was former railway sidings, so I would imagine there's a bit of contamination there from oil and anything dripping over the years. But I mean, you're essentially having a clean product on a raised base, I would imagine, and all you'll be dealing with is surface water, so it's not going to be changing anything that isn't there already. The fire burn is quite a deal below that, so I wouldn't imagine any flooding issues there other than normal heavy rain onto compacted soil, but I dare say that will be taken care of at the planning stage. So thanks very much for this. It's quite an interesting proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Carter. Councillor Al Samurai, I notice your hands up.
Thank you very much, convener. Most of the questions about the noise that I would have asked have already been asked, but I wanted to touch upon there was a mention of acoustic fencing when the presentation was being given. Just want to explore a little bit. Is that going to be actual acoustic fencing, or is it going to be done by way of what's going to be planted around about the boundary of the site?
There will be a combination. So primarily the acoustic fencing will make sure that there's no noise impact, and that's typically your timber construction, which it has a twofold purpose really. One is to absorb the noise, but also to make sure that it doesn't excuse me, bounce off or reflect anywhere else. So that's going to be primarily located around the equipment itself, and potentially down the eastern boundary. The planting is more for an aesthetic perspective to help assimilate the development, although the planting itself, of course, does have a certain noise attenuating quality as well. But it's certainly the fencing itself which is the more important aspect of that.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you, convener.
Thank you, Councillor Samurai. I don't see any other hands. I've just got a couple of questions. And Councillor Copeland, you spoke about daft laddie questions. Well, here's one from me. Because is there some sort of, how does it link to the external place it's deploying the energy to, and how does it gather it in? I mean, have we got to lay things under the ground, or do they already exist? As I say, I'm completely new to how these things work.
Yeah, I can pick up on that, Phil. No, that's a good question. It's often one that's overlooked, the actual, I guess, the fundamentals of these things. So it connects into local substation via an import-export cable, which is buried in the ground. So typically sort of approximately 150 mil cable, which would be 33 kV, which would connect into that voltage at the local substation. So that would be the common way, and this is to be explored as we move forward. But the expectation is that that's installed under public highway and the road going up to that substation. And that once it's connected to that that point in the network, it's obviously got that connectivity. The distribution point on the network connects to the national network, and it's all linked like a series. I mean, often the way we describe it is that the distribution network's like your sort of A and B roads, and then your main national grid network's a bit more like your motorway, and it sends the large amount of energy up and down the country and between England and Scotland. So this is connected into the, let's call it the B road, and has the capability to support that distribution, that local network, but obviously support the national grid on the requirements that they've got in terms of both balancing and providing resilience to the national network too.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. I assumed there was something going under the ground because we hadn't alluded to it. I thought I'd just double check. Sort of one other kind of question, and again, it's more to do with the airport, and you know, there's no kind of, and again, it could be a completely silly question, but there's no sort of sound waves or anything that can affect any of the instruments at the airport, I'm assuming, in this.
If I come in on that one, yeah, the short answer is no. There are no kind of impacts for something like this from an operational point of view. I can say that with all reliance because I am a pilot myself, so it's not something that is ever kind of given as an issue. Typically, some developments are normally looked at from a scale point of view and the potential height in terms of your flight paths, and that corresponds with the alignment of the runway itself, coming into land or to take off from either end. And also, what you normally find is tall buildings can potentially impair radar connection as well. So that's where the potential impacts can come. But certainly no, in terms of battery storage, it's not something that causes any kind of emission or anything along those lines to impact on technology for the air traffic control, anything along those lines.
That's great, because that was the only thing. The only other thing I suppose I would raise is you're talking about the acoustic barriers and the wooden sort of fencing, etc., that could potentially be put in place around the batteries. I know from experience, not from my personal experience, but just because of knowledge of it, that sometimes the way the acoustic barriers are erected alongside each other is that you can sometimes create a bit of a wind tunnel, which then can have reverberating noises, which becomes sort of quite irritating, can be quite whistly or screechy noises. So it was really just, I suppose, the way they're laid out, and I suppose the way the wind prevails there. I don't know how much that might affect, and I would never have thought of it myself if I hadn't actually seen it in action somewhere else. So that was really just a point to highlight that, you know, if we can make sure that we don't create any unintentional noise by creating any sort of wind tunnels that could make reverberating noises, because it's often that noise that can be more annoying than some of the louder noises.
Yeah, and a valid point as well. It's something that our noise consultant has took into account in the design, and the fencing itself is not kind of close together to create those kind of wind tunnel type effects. And similarly, what he does look at is the for want of a better word, the bouncing effects from one barrier to the other. So it's all designed to make sure there is no knock-on effect from one acoustic barrier to the next, and then of course back into the site. So yeah, that is taken into account as part of the layout itself.
Excellent, thanks, Jonathan. I know it's Councillor Copeland's just popped his hand up. Hopefully this might be your last question. Councillor Copeland. Are you there, Councillor Copeland?
I think he's took it down again.
Oh.
Sorry, can we have my mic on? I'm just wondering about lighting at the site. Given it's close to the flats, is it going to be sort of floodlit, or is it going to be low-level lighting?
Yeah, I can take that. So I mean, there will be lighting provisions that if there's a requirement to light up during hours of darkness, then you know, if anyone is visiting the site, they have full visibility in areas they need to walk through. It's not going to be floodlit as such, and that provision of lighting is on the rare occasions that the site could need to be visited during the hours of darkness. It will have low-level lighting otherwise, but nothing that would, I guess, disrupt the wider street scene or be, out keeping with the surroundings. There's just not a requirement to, on the basis that it's a remotely operated asset and people aren't generally walking around the site itself during the hours of darkness. Those routine maintenance visits will logically, as you'd expect, be routine and then scheduled in during daylight hours.
Right, Councillor
That's
Jones.
great. Thank you very much.
Okay,
No
thank
problem.
you. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands. I'd just like to thank you both for coming along today. It's clearly a very interesting project as we're all moving to these more renewable and net zero aspirations that we have. So we really do appreciate you coming along, and thank you to the local councillors who came along, Councillor Mackenzie, McGregor, and Al Samurai, who I know that have an interest, obviously, to make sure that their communities are well informed. So we do appreciate your time. Hopefully the questions weren't too onerous and certainly weren't maybe stupid questions, because, as I say, I'm quite happy to put my hands up to say I don't understand some of the technology. And I think many of my colleagues will affirm to this, giving sometimes I cut myself off of the computer, never mind anything else. So thank you very much, and we look forward, obviously, to receiving an application in due course. And if there's anything else, I'm sure the planning officers will be there to help you.